Welcome to Not Suitable for Democracy. I'm your host, Nick, and on today's episode, we're living up to the podcast name, talking about everything not suitable for democracy, specifically in the state of Maine, Democratic politics after the allegations from U.S. Senate candidate Graham Platner. Now, for those of you joining us for the first time, my name is Nick. I'm a progressive organizer out here in Western Queens talking about politics at the federal, state, and local level. And I'd love to share with you, what I've learned so far and how we can navigate our local politics throughout our national issues that impact each and every one of us. So, what's happening in Maine and how did we get here and how do we move forward? That's what I'd like to talk about today. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Real quick, make sure to subscribe to Not Suitable for Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, so you can be a part of the conversation. Now, back to the show. Before we jump into it, I just want to share that my heart truly goes out to Jenny Racicot, who is the woman who had to come forward and share these details with the allegations. And it's just so heartbreaking that she has to relive this trauma in order to verify details, in order to retell her story for the masses. And it's not fair to her, number one, that she had to experience this. Number two, that Graham Platner really betrayed her trust and, essentially violated her in a way that now all of us have just deep, deep regret in supporting his campaign, because none of us, number three, would have ever supported this type of man if this is the behavior that he exhibited throughout his history. And now that Jenny has to go through all this, it's just heartbreaking, again, because this is not fair to her or to any other victim of sexual assault, where I can empathize with that experience. And unfortunately, it can happen to anyone. So keep that in mind. Of course, it's a sensitive topic, but with that said, we'll do our best to at least navigate the nuances, the complexities, while trying to capture the situation, because Jenny's story deserves to be told with the truth. Graham Platner obviously doesn't need to be a part of the story, but the way the media frames it, they have a responsibility to do better. Let's begin. So today, we are dealing with the sexual assault allegations against Democratic nominee for Senate, Graham Platner, and he is looking to represent the state of Maine. So how did this all come about? Well, as of this recording on Thursday, July 9th, there has been so much news swirling about, new reports and updates to the story, so had to wait a few days before the dust settled and we can give you a clear examination of what went down. So, as of Monday, July 6th, Politico reported that morning that these allegations were coming from Jenny Racicot. Now, Jenny is one of Graham Platner's former girlfriends back in 2021 when this event occurred, and they had been dating on and off for about 2 years. So was it the most, heartfelt relationship? It sounded more, just kind of having a good time sort of thing. But after these events, of course, that ended. So allegedly what had happened on this one fateful night was that Jenny was texting Graham Platner, text exchange, and from that, it seemed like it was mutual in the sense that they were both enjoying each other's company, chit-chatting. But what we later found, according to Politico, was that there was some message that Jenny had sent Graham Platner. She wasn't in the mood, and Graham Platner had misinterpreted this as an invitation to come over. I think she had texted back or affirmed that, no, please do not come over. Of course, he came over anyway, and then by that night, by the time he was there, he was apparently drunk, deeply inebriated, and by that point, right, making advances that were unwanted where she had told him no, and the rest is history. But because of that, right, the seriousness of these allegations and obviously the sensitivity of this topic definitely calls for greater scrutiny. And what I mean by that is, it's one thing to just say he did this, she did this, but I think what makes this so charged was that this was a story from 5 years ago, which wasn't really that long ago. Of course, it's before, Platner had any idea about running for office, but again, this is, this will now change Democratic politics forever. So one thing about the reporting that I'd like to touch on is while Politico, shared this on Monday morning, let's not forget that it wasn't until later that evening that there was an interview conducted by CNN's Jake Tapper. Now, Jake Tapper, as you may know, he's not exactly a leftist progressive or someone who's going to be hailing the left, but he is critical, which is good, right? He did write that expose, that book about President Biden, and what he found behind the scenes with the Biden administration really propping up Biden. Quick tangent here, specifically when Biden was, I believe, doing a Hollywood fundraiser, and he didn't even know George Clooney's name. This is George Clooney, who's worth millions and millions of dollars, who's donated to Democratic causes throughout his career, and President Biden didn't even know who he was. So that is the type of Jake Tapper that is that I would think would dig into this, right? So by that evening, Jake Tapper interviewed Jenny Racicot on TV. So while I appreciate that he did have more sensitivity around his questioning, did ask her like the play of events, one thing that was actually discovered is that while she did share that she sent messages to Graham Platner and he came over unwanted, it was interesting that Breaking Points. Now, Breaking Points is a progressive podcast which has commentary from the left and the right, both anti-establishment, voices such as Crystal Ball and Sagar. They do a great job. But on this particular episode earlier this week, their other co-host, Ryan Grimm, phenomenal journalist from The Intercept, also from Drop Site News. Ryan has a long, expansive, and very thorough history, not only knowledge of Washington, D.C. and our United States American history and politics, but also he does the work. I know him personally, so I can definitely vouch that Ryan does his homework. So because of that, one thing that Ryan Grimm had found from Breaking Points was that in that interview between the Politico piece in the morning versus the Jake Tapper interview that evening, that they were actually missing details from Political story in the morning. And it was omitted that the text messages that Jenny Racicot was sending to Graham Platner was about a glute massage. Now, obviously, a glute massage is not an invitation to come over, but when you're talking about these kind of flirty banter, of course there's going to be miscommunication. And in this particular case, right, it led to horrible events that no one should ever have to go through. And, I just want to give Jenny Racicot just a moment of having some peace in her life, because this is going to upend her life. It already has. The actions upended her life. Now going through the media scrutiny is going to upend her life. And this is just what no one should ever have to go through. She had the courage and bravery to come forward with these details and relive this trauma, all to essentially just put an end to Graham Platner's campaign, because those actions that he had done, inexcusable, unforgivable. So interestingly enough, we see Ryan Grimm finding this disconnect between Politico and CNN, where then you must wonder, well, why did Politico omit that detail? Because the way the media has been portraying this over the past few days is, Graham Platner is some sort of monster, cannot be trusted, he's evil, he doesn't have a moral compass. But meanwhile, up until this point, that wasn't very evident or even made clear, where so many of us, I think, really believe that this was the guy who could take down Susan Collins and really galvanize the progressive movement in ways that we haven't seen in years. So with that said, with the media framing all of this, then you have to wonder, even the New York Times, where Ryan Grimm and Breaking Points also pointed out in an episode earlier this week that while the New York Times did have contacts from one of Graham Platner's ex-girlfriends, a different one actually, she had given them 5 sources, 5 friends, who could corroborate her interactions with Graham Platner. And, unfortunately, they were also quite negative and also, proving that he didn't have the moral fiber in his past relationships. But the interesting thing is that the New York Times, with those 5, 3 of the friends from the ex-girlfriend knew Graham Platner himself, right? Were there for the interactions, were, more aware of the relationship that he had with this woman. But then the other 2 had not known Graham, but just heard of these negative experiences in communication. So the New York Times did not talk to the 3 who knew Platner, but they only talked to the 2 who just heard of the conversations. And in that experience, they didn't really, showcase the, let's say, negativity. They didn't really dive deep into what these two had heard. But essentially, it sounded like the New York Times didn't really do their due diligence to corroborate the stories from Platner's past behavior with one ex-girlfriend, which then plays into this larger narrative that, yes, Graham Platner has negative relationships, bad relationships in the past, which all of this should have been prevented him from even running in the first place. So unfortunately, if the New York Times isn't doing their homework, CNN is, not following up on the questions and these types of things when asking about the story. And third of all, if Politico isn't even putting out the right details, you can start to see very clearly that while the actions of Graham Platner are horrible and horrifying, and Jenny Racicot wanted nothing more but to be a good citizen because her morals are above any one person, and because she knows that what she was doing was the right thing by retelling her story, she didn't want Politico or New York Times or CNN to butcher her experience. But that's exactly what they did. And then we must ask ourselves why. Why was the legacy media, Politico in print, CNN on TV, and of course an institution like the New York Times, why were they out to reframe the story in such a negative light against Platner? Well, from the fallout, it became very clear why. So, after the media headlines, what we found from Monday night into the next day, starting with Ro Khanna, progressive Congressman Ro Khanna, who endorsed Graham Platner, was the first to rescind his endorsement and called on Platner to step down. So because of that, this started a domino effect where so many progressive leaders, Democratic leaders, all called on Platner to step aside, if not also rescind their endorsement. We saw the Working Families Party rescind their endorsement the next day. We saw other major groups like Our Revolution, which is a Bernie-backed group, rescind their endorsement. And we saw a lot of Democratic leaders well into the night in the next 24, 48 hours call for him to step aside, such as Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, who also ran for alongside Vice President with former VP Kamala Harris in 2024. And we saw Massachusetts Governor Maura Healey also call on Graham Platner to step down. So what was interesting was while all these big names in the Democratic Party circles were calling for Graham Platner to step down, one thing I also question is, where were they when he actually won the nomination? Now, what we know with most big races, especially for the Senate, we usually see an outpouring of support and some sort of solidarity. You don't like saying that word solidarity for like mainstream establishment Democrats, but you do see that after someone wins their Senate race. Look at James Tellerico in Texas. Shortly after he won his race in the Democratic primary, he had support from President Obama. I mean, it might have been like months later, but the point is, you see that kind of coming together to really make sure that the Democratic nominee wins in the big, high-profile races. And we didn't see that with Graham Platner. Now, what makes this story also interesting was that only 4 weeks ago, on June 9th, Graham Platner not only won the Democratic primary with 70% of the vote, but he won with over 150,000 voters casting a ballot in his favor, which was the most ever seen in the history of Maine. So the fact that he had won the most votes ever really does say that a lot of people put their heart, soul, belief, and trust in him. And now 4 weeks later, he has just let all of us down. Highly inappropriate, inexcusable behavior. And it just shows that as much as we all wanted to believe, we were all duped. None of us knew. None of us actually could have foreseen that this was in his past, that these were the skeletons in his closet. And it's just such a disappointment where, I was even on this podcast many episodes earlier championing Graham Platner because I truly felt this was the guy. He had the right messaging. The way he communicated was just flawless. The way he presented his campaign, also doing so many town halls, talking to people, organizing. I think that's what I was most, for me, interested in. The fact that he was just such a great organizer, talking to people about everyday issues and connecting with them. That is so powerful. And what he wound up really doing was really just gaslighting all of us, pretending like, well, yes, his values could be true and he could be the anti-establishment, anti-war candidate who wants to invest in Maine. I think that's all still true. but gaslighting us that he was some man of moral character and good standing, that he would never have this type of behavior in his past because A, no one would want to believe it, but B, because if you're going to run for United States Senator, by default, it's the assumption that you don't have this type of moral character. But unfortunately, this is just politics. We know how many other men are there right now in the United States government who have either done this behavior, currently doing this behavior, or have yet to run for office thinking they can hide it. It wasn't too long ago we saw Eric Swalwell, who was running for governor of California, where allegations came out against him with his inappropriate actions that actually weren't so far in the past. And again, he also had to drop out and suspend his campaign. So, seeing how we got here, right? Graham Platner had this story come out about him in Politico, New York Times, CNN, doing follow-ups. Then we see establishment leaders and political figures and progressive circles all come out against him. But even the influencer crowd, right, where we see a lot of progressive and leftists online, those who with platforms and those in the comments, those are the ones who really said, I think it was Hassan Piker who made the phrase curtains down. And I saw that just play out on all the different podcast threads and in the comments, curtains down, meaning that it's game over for Graham Platner. Once the allegations like that come out, no one wants to be associated with you, especially with anyone who has like any sense of moral fiber and good standing to say like, hey, we support leftist politics, but not when it comes with that. And one other quote that I think encapsulates this moment really well was actually a statement by Michigan Democratic candidate for U.S. Senator Abdul El-Sayed. Now, Abdul tweeted out saying, like, basically, the people of Maine shouldn't have to choose between basically the immoral behavior of what Graham Platner had done versus choosing corporate servitude. And I think that really puts it best because we know the actions of Graham Platner are inappropriate, but we also know that, you know, big money is going to back Susan Collins and just continue this horrible cycle of just money in politics and not being able to deliver for the people. That's part of why Graham Platner had such a huge following, because he was so trustworthy that people really thought this was going to change things. We all believed in him. But El-Sayed's message really did ask for him to stand down, being like, hey, this is a choice for the voters, and like they shouldn't have to choose this. So like you really got to step down. And the other thing, if you think about it, talking about the media, Abdul El-Sayed, James Tallarico, and Graham Platner, those were the three headline-making candidates that we saw all grouped together over the past 6 months, where Tallarico won his election in Texas in March. We see, Graham Platner won his in June, and Abdul El-Sayed, he's on his way to win come the primary on August 4th in Michigan. And the point here is that those three folks, those candidates, those men, were seen as three new archetypes that exemplify a healthy form of masculinity. So part of what I also found refreshing about Graham Platner before all of these allegations was the fact that Graham Platner talked about his dark past in the sense of, his Nazi tattoo, his Reddit posts, also his post-traumatic stress disorder, and he did it in a way that showed forgiveness, that I am sorry for what I've done, this is not who I am today, and I think I've grown and moved on since then. And that is a message that so many Americans can resonate with. Not every American is perfect, and so many people have probably done behaviors they're not proud of, regret words they've said, and especially in the age of the internet, we're going to see so many people running for office who have said inappropriate things online. Even Daria Lisa Avila Chevalier, Democratic socialist who just won her election in New York 13, taking out Adriano Espaillat. She is a DSA member who, basically in the past had said F Kamala Harris. She had also said some things about abolition and like prison reform that some, center-left, let's say, podcast hosts found a great deal with and were, shocked by. But she still won. Because I think at the end of the day, folks understand we don't always say the perfect things all the time, but we can change and grow. So going back to these three with, these archetypes for a healthy masculinity, James Tallarico, using his faith to really showcase how he lives by his values and also is running on them in his platform as a candidate. even more inspiring is that his campaign speeches are like sermons. He knows how to communicate in a way that's gentle, calm, that presents a more, not stoicism, but just a steadiness. You can feel how emotional and heartfelt he truly and sincerely is, on top of the idea that he is talking about bringing people together. We are not strangers. We are just, neighbors. And the fact that, for someone like him who's running against, who wants to reform our immigration system when so many people are getting ripped apart, especially in Texas, by ICE agents, it's truly inspiring to see James Tallarico really come together with a unifying message, which does show leadership, especially in a healthy way, that it shouldn't be about fear and division. It should be about unity. And then even Abdul El-Sayed, charismatic guy, girl dad, hyper masculine, but very, very open to the idea that we need to care for each other. He's also a medical doctor in the sense that he got his PhD. He hasn't practiced medicine as in like the office all the time, but he does practice medicine in the way of being a healthcare worker. And because of that, he knows that our healthcare system is so dysfunctional and needs, a major rehaul, which is why he's running on Medicare for All. And you see in how the way he approaches the issues and really goes back at the media, the fake news, liberal media, as they say, from Trump supporters, he takes them on, where they'll try to frame everything negative against him, saying how because he's running against two women, that when he criticizes them, that he must be sexist or misogynist. And, that does play into the Islamophobic tropes of Muslim men mistreating women. So the whole idea that the media is leaning into that, again, brings back to my original point about how they're treating Graham Platner as the villain. Now, granted, his actions were villainous, but the idea, the way the story is presented versus how actions actually went down, that disconnect just proves that, the liberal establishment media and these institutions do not welcome progressives or leftist candidates, because we know that we challenge their bread and butter. And it's a shame that, Abdullah Sayed running a great campaign on his way to win, he has to deal with that. So even him having to, really reframe and punch back at the media, it doesn't make him look antagonistic, sure, but this is the kind of candidate that we need to not just roll over and say platitudes and kind of these virtue signaling kind of comments that people are kind of sick of. Most people that doesn't resonate with. We see that with the current president of the United States. I hate to say it, but Democrats are over here trying to say everything perfectly and not offend anyone and just try to be so, pristine with their language. But who is it helping? It's like you're giving inauthentic answers that don't really mean much, because then their actions in government show that they don't really care to begin with. Meanwhile, you got the 47th president of the United States saying anything he wants at any time he feels like it. Even on Twitter, almost causing World War III, and people still support him. And his approval ratings are down, but it's not zero. You know what I'm saying? So fast forward, here we are with Graham Platner, and obviously his allegations are disqualifying. But then you even look at the Senate candidate on the Republican side in Texas, Ken Paxton. He's the current attorney, or he is the current attorney general for Texas. And even he has so many inappropriate actions and misgivings and skeletons in his closet that are actually very laid out in the open, between bribery, corruption charges, cheating on his wife, all these things that if it was a Democrat, they'd be out. But Republican voters do not care. They do not care. Or at least I'll say they don't prioritize the moral actions compared to the platform they're running on, because they really do want to see America changed into a Christian white nationalist ethno state. And conservative, of course. I don't believe in it. I don't want that. But they're willing to sacrifice any moral ground to get there. Now, I'm not suggesting Democrats do that, because this is how we differentiate ourselves. If we're going to at least run on the morals and good values, we also have to live up to them to be more authentic. And unfortunately, Graham Platner did not do that. He may be fighting for those values, but he was not living up to those values. And that is what's most disappointing about this entire situation. Because now, moving forward, we'll have to grapple with how do we reassess not only the current candidate for U.S. Senator to represent Maine, but also candidates in the future. Because this will change Democratic politics forever.